Hello, my name is Azar Mirza-Beg, and this is my book In Search of the Truth and Exposure of the Conspiracy. And I want to read a portion of a chapter from the book. Chapter 1. The Guides. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. It was in my early childhood that I became aware of the significant place religion held in society, when I observed an argument between children. One group insisted that they believed in the existence of God, while the other held the opposite stance, claiming that there is no God. Both sides stood firm in defense of their respective positions. The fact that the matter of the existence or non-existence of God caused such a heated debate made me to begin to understand its significance for mankind. At the same time, I wondered which standpoint is correct and which is false. I also noticed that some parents taught their children religious ideas, while others held an atheistic position. I wondered why people could not come to an agreement about this matter. Later in my early youth, I saw that my soul had religious inclinations, and that believing in God was its essential requirement, as well as an intense desire to find the truth behind the religious tenets. In the atheistic realities of the Soviet Union, I did not receive any encouragement to follow the career of a clergyman. However, I realized that a religious seminary would allow me to acquire the required knowledge that would solve my problems and would also help me to understand the mysteries of life and the afterlife. Even though I was born in a Muslim family, I had no firm convictions about which theological school I want to enroll in, Muslim or Christian. Since our house was situated in a Christian and Jewish neighborhood, I was under the influence of the prevailing attitudes of these people, who considered Muslims as an inferior race, as an uncivilized, backward people. This made me share their viewpoint about the inferiority of everything Muslim, even their religion. Besides, Muslim priests in Baku were of the uneducated sort, who had no real religious credentials. These people from dawn to dusk hung around mosques and graves of holy men to earn money. I had no desire to be one of them, a member of this ignoramus class. Once in a magazine I saw a picture of an Indian yogi that struck my imagination. I was impressed by the strange postures and exercises of this folk. I decided I had to find a way to travel to India, where I could find yogi sages who would teach me their wisdom. I thought, surely this group should know something important, should be in possession of truth, of some secret that made men turn their backs on society and choose to live an aesthetic life in caves and woods. A couple of years passed like this, while I constantly cherished the idea of going to India, this mysterious land of adventure and magic. But then I met Leon. He was a sophisticated intellectual person who made a little business by the illegal selling of religious literature. From him I acquired my first religious books, photocopies of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and the Gospels. Later he switched to another business, collecting Russian icons. 100 or so valuable icons covered the walls of his apartment. Much later I learned about his drug addiction. The proceeds from the antiquarian business provided money to support his expensive habit. This expensive habit. He told me that he was a part of a ring of art smugglers involving in the trafficking of contraband icons abroad. He offered me icons to buy, with life-size figures and images of Christian saints. "Or I can sell you this one," he said, pointing at an icon as big as a door frame, bearing an image of Christ. It was a huge wooden board, bearing nothing but the head of the Saviour. He said, "This icon once graced the entrance of one of the Kremlin's towers, but was removed after the revolution." I asked, "How can I transport such a huge and heavy board to my hometown without attracting the attention of the police? Why don't you offer me the smaller pieces?" "The smaller ones I smuggle through the border to the west, to Germany, so I don't need these large icons," he replied. Leon was the person who introduced me to Sufism. I told him once about my interest in Sanskrit, and he found it a ridiculous idea. He said, "You are Muslim. Rather than learning Sanskrit, go and learn Arabic or Persian, which are more related language to your Turkic, so that you can study your Islamic classic literature." "But Islam has no philosophy, mysticism or yogis," I exclaimed. "You're wrong," he said. "Muslims also have philosophical literature. I can sell you a book about Gurdjieff. This man was also from the Caucasus, as you are, and he was a Sufi." "Who are Sufis?" I asked. "They are Muslim yogis," he said. I had never heard anything before about Sufis, so I went to a library and checked encyclopedias to find out about Sufism. Later I heard about the existence in Moscow and Leningrad of clandestine Gurdjieff groups, where his mysterious teachings were studied. In those times, among the Soviet golden youth, it was very fashionable to attend these underground Sufi lectures. All the people that flocked to the gatherings were non-Muslims. Many of them were Jews, as was Leon. George Gurdjieff was a mystic who made himself famous among the intellectuals of Europe and America, while attracting much attention in the press due to his colorful personality. He was born in 1873 in Transcaucasia to a Greek family. Despite his Orthodox Christian background, he decided to travel to remote parts of the East to look for true religious teaching. Later, when he found what he was looking for and became an accomplished mystic, he decided to spread his ideas and teaching in Europe. Although he managed to establish a reputation for himself as an important mystic in the first part of the 20th century, he did not leave behind any real mystical school or complete doctrine. His followers were comprised of European intellectuals who were not suitable types to follow the mystical path. Some people saw in him a Christian sage who had the intention of reviving the original early Christian teaching. Others believed his tales about him belonging to Sarmung Brotherhood, which originated in ancient Babylon. Nevertheless, anybody who is familiar with the Sufi system can detect that the true source of his knowledge came from Islamic mysticism. Why then did he deny his Sufi background? It can be explained by several factors. He was born in a Christian family. He never received a true Muslim education, and his knowledge of Arabic and Persian was not perfect enough to allow him to be acceptable in Islamic society as a religious teacher. Similarly, he would not have much chance to be accepted by Europeans if he came forward as a representative of Muslim mysticism. At the beginning of the First World War, he started reading his lectures in Moscow and St. Petersburg, full of speculations and patriotism. At a time when the Russian public was not ready to follow any religious path unless it was Christian, his sanguine and boisterous personality drew all kinds of people to him. Wherever he went, he created a sensation, bizarre happenings, and scandals. He was a Sufi master belonging to the sect of Malamatiya, which is the path of blame. The Malamatis are considered the people of a superior order, the purest esoteric types, individuals who do not care for the opinion of ordinary people or the opinion of the world, but prefer to behave in an unconventional way. According to them, the wearing of distinctive religious garments, following traditions, and leading a pious way of life are externals that can impress the ignorant crowd, while a true mystic should seek the acceptance of God only. Malamatis, during their lives, were accused of being lunatics, rascals, and ill-reputed types, while their sanctity and inner truth remained unknown to the public. They did not follow any tradition. The Malamatis were true Sufi sages whose only concern were to preserve an inner truth, unlike the pious sheikhs, who, while being the formal heads of variant orders, often had no real mystical credentials themselves, and were never real initiates of the mystical path. Today, there are groups in the West who describe themselves as the followers of Gurdjieff's teaching. They have appropriated his name by setting up Gurdjieff centers, where his teachings are corrupted, distorted, and turned into a cult, into a profitable business. For many years, the only religious literature available to me were 3 books: the Gospels published before the Revolution, and photocopies of Yoga Sutras, and P.D. Ouspensky's In Search of the Miracles. Ouspensky was a famous pre-revolutionary Russian mathematician and philosopher who spent many years with Gurdjieff as his pupil and follower. Later I heard about a new trend in which Moscow's intellectuals, the former members of Gurdjieff groups, switched to study the teaching of a fashionable author called Idris Shah. This man was a son of an Afghan noble and a Scotswoman. Unlike Gurdjieff, he was never shy to state that he was a Muslim and Sufi. He established a publishing house, the Octagon Press, in England, produced a series of Sufi classics, and became the foremost person in the world to popularize Sufism. Despite the fact that he was the most prominent representative of the Sufi movement in the second part of the 20th century, he was merely a theoretician who was disinterested in the formation of a school, a dervish order, or study circle. As he himself said, not every man has a teaching talent or has a mission to give personal instruction. Thus he turned down all the requests of aspiring students, preferring theoretical Sufi literary activities to being a personal mystical tutor to anybody. An English author wrote that Idris Shah did not just describe himself as the highest authority on Sufi matters in the world, but he even claimed to be the pole, the pivot of the universe. To this, the least that could be said was that nobody contributed more than Shah to popularize the doctrine of Sufism in literary works around the world. As Shah said, he had done as much as was humanly possible for a writer to promote Sufi ideas. As to the matter of his being the pole of the world, Qutb, there is no documentary evidence that Shah himself made this statement. It could have been that somebody else described him as such. Nevertheless, even if he made this claim, there was nobody to challenge him, since the other modern Sufis were pygmy personalities who could not be taken seriously no matter what they said or did. Qutb is a Sufi term which can be translated from Arabic as either of the two geographic poles. In Sufi circles, they use this term to describe the highest position in the hierarchy of saints, the leader of the Sufi brotherhood, on whom the order of the universe depends. In Muslim folklore, there is a legendary mystic, Mullah Nasruddin, whose anecdotes are widely circulated among the population. This is one of his stories. Nasruddin is an old man. One day he is standing outside his village at a crossroad. One traveling dervish stops by him and asks a question. I am going to a pilgrimage to a holy site, to the mausoleum of a saint. I have lost my way, and my compass is broken. Could you tell me where the pole is? Nasruddin sticks his staff in the ground. Here it is. This is exact spot where the pole is. The man looks at Nasruddin in puzzled way and then speaks angrily. Prove it. I have already proved it, Nasruddin tells him. But if you don't believe me, then you can go and travel around the world, circumnavigate the earth, to find if I am right or wrong. The present-day Muslims, who are not familiar with Sufi terminology or ideas, understand this anecdote as if this Muslim sage is mocking the pilgrim and replying in a rude manner. In reality, this Sufi tale was designed to illustrate their idea of the world, their viewpoint, and the specifics of the mystical path. Thus, Nasruddin, who is a Sufi master, stands at a crossroad, at a meeting point for travelers from different places. The usual spot for all men of wisdom in the Eastern fairy tales to give directions to the people. Then, as the dervish who is an aspiring mystic stops to ask for direction to a whole site, Nasruddin himself, a holy man, a guide of the mystical path, advises the man to rather stay with him in that place, which is the ultimate holy place on the earth, to accept him as his teacher. Thus, Nasruddin used the word the pole not for its geographic meaning, but rather he answered philosophically, using it as a Sufi technical term, since the pole is a perfect man, a model man, the most advanced human being, the highest representative of God on the earth, and at the same time a rank. It is an ultimate goal, an ultimate designation of stage, an ultimate destination or stage. It is the final point of the aspirations of the Farah of the Sufi way. His other statement, I already proved it, means that he had already proved his credentials as Qutb through his work, his life, and his holy being. Although I lived in England during Idris Shah's last years, I never had a chance to meet him personally. He passed away on November 23, 1996. May God grant him mercy. Some 30 years ago, a distinguished Indian yogi, Devananda, moved to the West and set up yoga centers in Europe and America to popularize his yoga school. It seems he was not a mystic himself, but described his teacher, Shivananda, the founder of the school, as a great mystical persona. Devananda here and there in his book brings out passages and quotations from the literary works of his guru, in which he described his various mystical experiences, spiritual states, and insights. Shivananda died in India in 1963. In the 60s, countless thousands of Western youth traveled to India to look for gurus, wise men, and mystics. India, with its exotics, fakirs, and sadhus, gave them the impressions of a place full of holy men. But in reality, today, spirituality in India, as everywhere else, is at its lowest point. So much so that this huge subcontinent could be likened to an immense spiritual desert. However, Shivananda, it seems, proved that the land is not a complete wilderness after all. Some 40 years ago, the Soviet authorities put on trial a Buddhist scholar called Dandaron, who was accused of secretly preaching religious teachings to the Soviet youth while holding the position of an academician. He was of Buryat descent, a Mongol ethnicity whose traditional faith is Buddhist, and was born in the Siberian region of on the China's border. He authored, to his credit, several scholarly works on Buddhism. Dandaron was a devoted Lama, a saintly person. He continued to preach religion all his life, despite everything, whether it was in a confinement of a prison or outside. He established a society in which he taught a tantric Buddhist teaching. The authorities used their standard tactics against him, falsely accusing him of immoral behavior, organizing sexual orgies, and spoiling university students. The prosecutors misinterpreted the sexual symbolism of the tantric doctrine for actual agitation for sexual immorality. He was imprisoned along with several of his followers, while others, under the pressure of the police, bore false witness against him. Ironically, the Soviet clergy, without exception, instead of conducting their direct duties in serving God and religion, were cooperating with the authorities and stood most loyal to the atheistic regime. While Dandaron, whose official position was a propagandist of atheism, heroically worked to disseminate religious knowledge. He spent in total some 30 years in Siberian labor camps and died there while serving his ordinal sentence in 1974. It would be appropriate to quote here a verse of Nesimi, a sheikh of a Sufi brotherhood who had been accused by a Pharisaic clergyman of heresy and was condemned to execution by flaying. Whether doth cut the zealot's finger, he will deny the truth. Lo, but this truth lover cries not, though they flame from head to foot. N.V. Abayev was yet another Buryat, a Buddhist specialist, an academician who made himself famous among the Soviet Orientalists as the foremost authority on Lamaism and Chan Zen Buddhism. He authored several scholarly books on the art of self-cultivation by mind control in the Chan and Taoist schools, as well as on the martial arts of Asia. In his works, he followed the Soviet regulations by bringing in quotations from Marx, Lenin, and Engels. But otherwise, all his writings were very clever. They went much further than the standard works of Orientalists. Abayev had very positive opinion about D.T. Suzuki and his works. I never read the books of this Japanese professor, since I found them much too academic and theoretical, unlike the intuitive, experimental approach of the mystical authors. In my opinion, Suzuki was just a theoretician of Buddhist doctrine, a Buddhist philosopher who could not instruct his pupils or give guidance on the mystical path and teach its methods. But since Abayev praised his works, I accept this Japanese professor as a good religious theoretician. I personally never met Abayev. I heard about him from an acquaintance whose friend, a devout Buddhist, had a chance to meet him in Ulan-Ude, Abayev's hometown, near Lake Baikal. The renowned academician, despite his outward disguise as a Soviet atheist scientist, admitted in his conversation with this young man to being a man of faith, a true follower of Buddhism. Later he even made another confession to his guest. In that he claimed that he had reached the upper stage of the path and was on the verge of attaining the last stage of enlightenment. Soon the young devotee left him, promising to keep his secret to protect him from persecution, by the secret police. Nevertheless, despite his promise, the young man told his friend about the conversation, who in his turn told the story to me. Since it is very rare that one is able to meet a true mystic, a true master, I desired to go to this Buryat region to see this man. However, since I did not have his house address, I postponed the trip, and it never took place. I do not even know for sure if he is still alive or dead. I heard this story more than 20 years ago. At that time he was already a very old man, so probably he is no longer with us. It can sound strange that a Muslim person should be interested in meeting a Buddhist holy man. To explain this, I will say first that Islam considers the Christian faith, Hinduism and Buddhism also to be heavenly religions. Unlike those pseudo-religious, man-made cults, which have no true prophets or heavenly scriptures. Secondly, the mystical path, according to mystical authorities, is identical for all religions. The difference is only in religious traditions, customs, dogma, and rituals, while the mystical path is the same, since the inner physical laws, the laws of the inner invisible world, are the same for the followers of different faiths. A Hindu holy man is no different from a holy Muslim. Their inner truth is identical. However, for an ordinary Muslim, it would be difficult to accept a Hindu holy man as such, since his Hindu religious doctrine, his discourse, customs and manners would be very unacceptable to him as a follower of Mohammedan tradition. However, to a Muslim mystic, Hindu or Buddhist mystics would be no strangers. Thus, the true masters, holy men of different religions, are more related to each other than the ordinary believers of their own religion, who may appear to them as strangers, as aliens. In fact, any aspiring mystic starts his religious life and study within his own religious tradition. But after completion of this study of the fundamentals of his particular faith, he approaches the next stage, the mystical path, which is similar for the adherents of all religions. Thus, the Muslim mystic, Sufi, and a Buddhist and a Hindu mystic are going along the same mystical path, because despite the fact that various religions outwardly differ from each other, their inner content, their core, their inner dimension is the same. People can be followers of different religions, but they are not different as human beings. Since human beings share similar organs, their inner way to God should be the same for all humankind. Nevertheless, for a holy man to be an acceptable person, to be recognized as such, he should address and speak only to his own community or tribe, to the members of his own religion. Otherwise he will be misunderstood and ignored. The matters of the other world, the invisible world, are not comprehensible to ordinary people, to the world. Thus, a true master, to be acceptable, to be explicit, is going to use the words, metaphors, expressions, and vocabulary of the given religion to be appreciated by his own community. To finish this passage about Abayev, I will admit that I cannot be sure about the truth of his claims of reaching higher stages of enlightenment. It could have been true or untrue. Nevertheless, the man deserves respect for his scholarly achievements. It is obvious that he was not a cheap charlatan, but a serious man, so his words should be taken seriously. But he was not my spiritual guide or a personal teacher, so I can't say whether he was a good guide of the path or not. In the last century, there lived one more of the Buddha's followers, Chogyam Trungpa, who had claims to the position of a true teacher, to being a true spiritual guide. Born in Tibet, he went to Britain and then to America to preach his Tibetan Buddhist doctrine. Today, in many parts of Europe, Canada, and America, many of his meditation centers are operating. Although in the West, many thousands of Oriental meditation centers can be found, they differ from one another by their names only, while their contents and substance are very similar. These centers in our modern consumer society offer custom-made spiritual teachings to suit Western tastes. People who have no religious credentials run these centers. According to them, all religions, in order to be relevant to the needs of modern life, should be reduced to the simple meditation technique to facilitate healing, to cure depression, neurosis, illnesses, and to fight stress. Religious ideas, according to them, are non-essentials that deserve no respect and should go into the garbage bin. It is clear that these meditation centers, along with their instructors, have a special political agenda to disorient people, to make them stay away from places of worship, and ultimately from religion. Although various Buddhist organizations and temples already existed in the West, Trungpa's centers offered something else. They attempted to take a step further, to make a religious institution which was less formalistic and ritualistic and more oriented to mysticism and real personal development. He brought to his centers the practice of solitary retreat, where they built special chambers or cabins so that the chosen candidates could spend a month or two to assist them to experience mystical insights and heavenly visions. Trungpa's book, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, proved him to be a very different kind of teacher, somebody who understood the inner, mystical, esoteric contents of religion, unlike other formal representatives of Buddhism, who are merely familiar with the letter of religious doctrine. Unlike authors who expand Buddhist teachings in a formal and dogmatic way, he used very modern language with common-day terms and ideas to explain the essence of religion. Early in my school years, I understood how to tell a good teacher from a poor teacher, a mere imitator. A truly knowledgeable man can use simple, ordinary language to describe the most complicated scientific ideas, so that even a child would be able to understand him, while the bad teacher would prefer to use technical terms in excess and an incomprehensible vocabulary to hide his ignorance and lack of understanding. Therefore, it can be said that this Tibetan Lama was the only true Buddhist that reached the Western shores, the only one who was offering the real stuff rather than cheap copies. With his death in 1987, his organization became an empty shell that gradually and inevitably will lose its distinctive features. It will turn itself into an ordinary religious institution with no live masters or mystical teachers. An instruction book and a chamber for a solitary retreat is not enough to bring forth a true initiate of the way. A real teacher, a live spiritual instructor is necessary. Such an instructor should be an all-accomplished master himself, a mystic who is familiar with the way and all its particulars, making him capable of giving guidance to others. However, no ordinary religious institutions have such kind of instructors. They are not interested in acquiring them. They are after other things. Here I feel that some readers may feel confused with my extensive use of the word mysticism in connection with Buddhism, Hinduism and Islam. What I am trying to say is to clarify the point that in all religions, all religious teachers are divided into two clear-cut distinct categories: ordinary conventional clergymen on one side, and on the other side advanced human beings, the holy men. This second group is made up of individuals whom I call mystics, since they are not ordinary, regular people, but belonging to the category of extraordinary humans who can produce different supernatural phenomena, such as reading minds, performing miracles, seeing the future, flying in space and time, and so on. Every religion has its own venerated personalities, saints, or holy men. Although the priesthood accepts the holy men of their own particular religion, still they feel uneasy with them, as they are aware that these individuals are very different, very much unlike themselves, the priests. While they see them as strangers, as people who are made of different materials, clerics cannot help but canonize them, to accept them as a part of their religion, since it requires holiness and possibly its life representatives. As I see it, the priesthood regards their saints with suspicion, preferring to see them as dead, venerated corpses, rather than having to deal with them while they are still alive. Clerics claim that they are the custodians of the Word of God, but there are many cases in history when they sent their saints to death. They speak about their respect and love for the holy books, but when they appear at the time, they do not care for the welfare of their saints, the individuals whom I would describe as the ultimate representatives of religion and God on the earth. Priesthood, clerics, and theologians, by being bookish types, know religion from books only. They are better suited to deal adequately with the affairs of this world. Except for the holy books, this crowd would know nothing about religion. Even the idea of God would never cross their minds. Thus, prophets, holy men, and saints are God's choice to be the ultimate representatives of faith, to be His messengers. Hence, no matter how learned, educated, or intellectual clerics are, in the end, these types of people can gain respect, but never achieve the status of true holy men or saints. Therefore, clerics on the day of judgment will be amazed and horrified as the rest of the humanity. In fact, any religion which has no contemporary saints is a dead religion, or at least is at its lowest point of stagnation. In one Chinese book it says, "First there was a true man, and only then there was a true teaching." Thus, no matter how great the holy books are, God sent them to man, who is the ultimate purpose or meaning of the creation, since without him the universe would be blind, empty, and incomprehensible. However, the utmost human is the perfect man of the mystics. Ibn Arabi was one of the greatest Muslim mystics. Born in Spain in 1165, he wrote in one of his books how in Fez, Morocco, he recognized the pole of the time, the perfect master of the spiritual way, who was trying to hide his high status and identity from the public and the world. Sufis called the leader of their particular order the pole, while the pole of the poles, Qutb al-Aqtab, is the pole of all orders. Unless this type of perfect man reveals himself, the ordinary person has no chance to recognize him by relying on his mind or judgment. Alternatively, one has to himself be like them, like the pole, an advanced mystic, or at least one's mystical spiritual status has to be very, very close to his. Sheikh Waliullah of Delhi lived in India in 18th century. He was the most prominent Muslim theologian of his time, and at the same time was a Sufi of the highest rank. In one of his works he wrote about the highest stage of the mystical way, saying that he himself was stationed very close to it. Later he achieved this last stage. While reading his writing, a reader can see that this man, while with certitude, is describing very advanced mystical stages and states with all their particulars, so that it leaves no doubt that he knows his subject from his own experience. His books and mystical writings are proof of his mystical credentials. To doubt his achievements is similar to doubt the existence of the sun or the moon. While it's impossible to impress an unintelligent person with philosophical speculations in books, because they are not able to understand them or to demonstrate any emotions, wonder, or enthusiasm for them. Such a person might become very much excited by magical deeds, supernatural powers, and by the acts of primitive sorcery. My acquaintance with Gurdjieff's literature drew my attention to the Mohammedan East, which may look less of an exotic place in comparison to India, but more promising for finding mystical schools. Time has wiped out the last vestiges of Muslim power from the map of India, and with it diminished its Islamic strongholds. Today you can no longer find well-educated circles there that can speak or write in Arabic or Persian, but without the knowledge of these two essential languages, the Muslim world will have no culture or civilization. There would be no writers or readers. Therefore, for a Muslim traveler, today's India is an incomprehensible place. Thus, the language barrier forced me to make other travel plans, to consider other destinations rather than the Indian subcontinent, not to mention the Iron Curtain. And this narrowed my choice to Soviet Central Asia, that is, the historic Turkestan. I remember in the summer of 1973, in the open-air mosque of the Khoja Ahrar monastery in Samarkand, a local woman paid money to a mullah to read a ritual prayer for a member of her kin. After finishing it, the jovial young mullah asked me about the goal of my voyage, whether I was looking for a wife among the local girls. I replied, "No, I am looking for a Sufi master who will initiate me into the way." He laughed, saying, "Those days when this land had Sufis are gone. You can't find them anywhere around here." "Maybe at least one or two are left?" I asked. His firm answer was no. His firm answer was again no. Then, after a little consideration, he said, "If you go to the neighboring Tajikistan, to the mountains, who knows, maybe you can find somebody there." He later explained his words by saying that in the mountains in Tajikistan there were places where the Soviet realities had not yet reached. Modern times had not yet reached these distant villages there. At that time I could not get to the mountains of Tajikistan. Nevertheless, I thought that the young mullah gave me important information, and for several years I cherished the idea that one day I would find an opportunity to go there and possibly find myself a Muslim guru. Over the next 10 years I made several trips to Turkestan, but I could not find any trace of the Sufi folk there. The Soviet Central Asian republics were as Soviet as any other part of the Union. The atheistic disease had reached to its every corner. No part of it remained unaffected. Old city fortifications, mosques, mausoleums, and even Hanakas, the Sufi study centers, were there, but they stood empty. There was no life inside. They were no longer the magnetic centers of attraction for society, since there was no Muslim society, but only a Marxist society with no traditions, no faith, and no real values. There was an interesting encounter when I visited the only remaining functioning madrasa, a Muslim seminary, in Bukhara, to see if there was any chance for me to be permitted to study in it. I met a young man of my age. He was very polite with me and offered to take me inside the closed premises, where an old guard let us in. While we were inside, he, a student of the seminary, gave me a little guided tour. "You can enroll in this madrasa if you can find a mullah to recommend you," he said. But it will be a very costly affair for me to move here and study away from my home," I replied. To this he answered, "Your parents will help you. If your parents' money does not suffice, then your relatives can come together and help you by gathering funds." "No, it's not possible," I said. "Your parents and relatives are good Muslims, are positive towards religion, but my parents and relatives are Communist Party members. They are hostile to religion and would not approve nor understand it." Later, as left the madrasa and stood outside in the summer evening, I confessed to him about my intention to find a way to defect to the West, to escape from the Soviet Union. But this would be an instance of grave state treason. If you manage it, your parents will be left behind, and it will ruin them. The state will punish them severely, he said. Why should I think about them? I can't live in Marxist Russia. I have to go to America to freedom. It is not good, he told me. They are your father and mother, and you are a Muslim. It is duty for a Muslim to care for his parents, to look after them when they get old. I did not say anything else, but reflected on the fact that he was a clear-cut, all-round Muslim boy, unlike me. I was different. I cannot follow the rules. If I followed the rules of society, then I would have enrolled in a Communist Party school which had bred future party apparatchiks, the state's elite. My old people had their own life, while I had my own. Maybe I am not a good Muslim, but neither am I a good commie. Some 10 years later, on my next tour to the Bukhara region, I met the man again. He was no longer a seminary student, but a priest, Ahund, in charge of Khoja Zainuddin Khanaka, which is nowadays used as a mosque. I reminded him about our encounter 10 years before, but he remembered nothing. The people of Bukhara all speak the Tat language, a pidgin form of Persian. So he inquired from me whether I had managed to learn Persian so we could switch to communicating in Persian, since Russian was neither his nor my native language. He asked me whether I observed all the obligations of Sharia, of the sacred law of Islam, and if I was living the Muslim way of life. I stated that I, unlike him, was not interested in formal study of Islamic sciences, but rather I was a man of mystical way of Sufism, the spiritual movement of Islam. To this he said that he is acquainted with some Sufi works, and had read a famous Persian treatise of Al-Hujviri, the revelation of the veil. Besides that, he said that he had managed to master the art of calligraphy, learned Arabic and Persian. He added that there was no match to him in today's Bukhara, in the knowledge of Islamic sciences, but still he was no equal to the Muslim scientists that lived in previous centuries. He said, I can read their books and understand their language, but I have no mind to write anything myself. It must be noted here that despite all the changes in Turkestan, a traveler can get a taste of the real East there. A sense of mystery and atmosphere of spirituality radiating not just from the grandeur of Islamic historic architecture, but from the manners and behavior of the people as well. Unlike in the Caucasus, which was the periphery of the Muslim world. Turkestan at all times, but for the very latest communist period, was one of the most important spiritual centers of Islam. Still, the plague of Marxism caused much more destruction here than that of the Genghis Khan's armies, with the total elimination of Islamic heritage accumulated in more than 1,000 years. As Nasruddin said, it is silly to fight with the elements. Thus, historians are making a mistake when they describe the Mongol invasion as representing the mortal threat to Islamic civilization. Mongolic nomads were like a destructive hurricane arriving from the east. Unlike the Mongols, who were driven by the elements, escaping from a famine in the Gobi Desert, Marx's ideology was a poisonous, carefully calculated formula maliciously prepared with an intent to affect the heart, the soul of society, which is its spirituality, ultimately destroying its religious foundations. Before Bukhara, I visited Tashkent, a faceless, boring modern city. I was looking for old manuscripts. Somebody advised me to go to a square in front of the Barakhan Madrasa, where book vendors offered pre-revolutionary religious literature. This small square, or rather small space between a mosque and the madrasa, which at the time was the only higher education Muslim seminary for the entire USSR, was full of undercover agents and shady-looking personalities. Nearby, a small modern house had been built. The plaque on the wall informed us that this was the Young Communist League's Red Corner, which was a propaganda center. Places like these were usually strategically stationed near to places of worship, so that young atheist militia could police the area to prevent any kind of religious meetings or demonstrations. As I stood there in the center of the square, I felt most uncomfortable and vulnerable. The place was something like Bermuda Triangle. You can go there and disappear forever, and no trace of you will ever be found. I had a feeling that this place was nothing but a secret police trap to catch strangers like me, since informers and undercover cops stood there and ready to come upon me in case I took a single wrong step. I made a few careful inquiries, but it seemed nobody had any books on mysticism, which probably was not a sought-after subject among the seminary students of the madrasa. Then I noticed a man in a Kyrgyz hat and ethnic clothes, who was standing at a distance looking at me and smiling as if he knew me from somewhere. At first I did not pay him much attention, since I took him for a young seminary student. Some time later, when I saw many wrinkles on his neck, I understood that he must be a middle-aged man. He was not a madrasa student, but was rather the seminary teacher himself. His youngish, fair-skinned face illuminated peace and kindness. All the body language of this man signaled to me an invitation to approach and strike up a conversation with him. His Mongol face definitely had a certain radiance, and in his eyes I saw some kind of recognition of me. I thought, maybe he was a master of the mystical way who perceived my spiritual aspirations and expected me to approach him and ask to be accepted as his pupil. I was in a confused state of mind. On one hand, I wanted to go away from this dangerous place. On the other hand, to find a Sufi master had been my dream for many years. But I stood there as if paralyzed. I could not make myself approach him, as I was afraid to give myself away, to be attacked by the police, by these dogs that were after my flesh and blood. Sometime later I saw him still there, sitting on his heels on the sandy surface of the square. Although his back was turned to me, I felt as if he still waited and expected me to approach him. I felt very silly. Many contradictory thoughts were crossing my mind. First, that it was my duty to get to him and find out whether he was the man that I was looking for all these years. Secondly, there were many minor considerations, such as should I approach him and then greet him by taking his hands in my two hands and shake it, as everybody else around me was doing? Should I start a conversation in the Imperial Russian, the language of the Soviet Empire, which probably was not the proper thing to do under the circumstances? What language other than Russian could serve us as a lingua franca of today's Turkestan? Many Turkic ethnic groups that populate the region speak in their own various dialects. However, I cannot speak any of this properly. Maybe alternatively, I should speak to him in the dialect of modern Turkey. However, I did not think that he spoke Turkish. I could not make my mind up on anything. The Kyrgyz and his assistants at last stood up. I saw as he spat angrily on the ground in front of himself and went. I saw as he spat angrily on the ground in front of himself and went away. I stood there, not moving, wondering whether he was angry with me for not taking the initiative to make his acquaintance. I said to myself, if he really is a master, then I have lost my opportunity to meet the true murshid, teacher, in this life. Similarly with him, if he was who I thought he was, he had a good excuse to be very angry with me, because I knew by now that it is a rare chance to meet a true master in one's lifetime. But it is equally difficult to meet a true disciple. A master can sit and wait his entire life for the prospect of an encounter with a disciple with the potential to become a master himself, which in the end may never come to pass. And now this Kyrgyz master saw me standing in confusion, not being able to find in me the courage to approach him. However, later, in trying to find an excuse or self-justification, I thought that if I had made an acquaintance with him, not just I, but he as well, would have ended up in a Siberian labor camp. Later in Bukhara, I asked my acquaintance, the Ahund, if he knew this Kyrgyz man, whether he was a Sufi. No, he is not a Sufi, he is a professor of theology for Kyrgyz seminary students, he said. I perceived that although he had an Islamic education, he was no different from other ignorant people who think that to be a Sufi one has to wear a distinctive headdress, a patched frock, and belong to a dervish order, rather than have an inner state of spiritual condition. The ordinary people do not see beyond outward appearances. They notice only superficial signs and attributes. Then he said, I could direct you to the real Sufis, to a Sufi commune that exists near Dushanbe in Tajikistan. He named Sufi order to which these people belonged. He also told me that their leader, a sheikh, was a holy man. This man, according to him, had magical powers, could perform miracles, and heal illnesses. Besides that, he said he had tens of thousands of followers. What is his name? I inquired. Turajon, he said. Can you give me his address? I asked. Yes, I can give it to you, but it is unlikely that you will be allowed to have an audience with him, he said. Thus, I took a flight to Dushanbe, the main city of Tajikistan, this mountainous Soviet region. Tajiks are the only Persian-speaking ethnic group in the whole of Turkestan. The information that I had was of doubtful character. The whole story was making no sense at all. How would the KGB allow all this? The idea sounds extraordinary, as it was going against all the rules and conventions of the Marxist state. On my way there, I was trying to make sense out of all this, but without any success. A Sufi order, a religious organization, functioning freely within the borders of Soviet Union was an impossible idea. I had a substantial amount of money on me. I was dreaming, thinking that even if the story about Turajon proved to be a phony one, then at least I will be able to find a mountainous village to which the Soviet way of life had not yet reached. I remembered my recent conversation with an old devout Muslim in Bukhara. I complained to him about my dissatisfaction with my lot, with our hard times, that I could not properly conduct my religious Sufi activities in our own Muslim lands. To which he said, no borders can block us from God's grace, Rida. I liked his answer very much. Unlike the region where I came from, in Turkestan many people remained loyal to their faith and their spiritual values, rather than yielding to the Marxist realities of the Soviet Union. Many people there accepted poverty and marginalization to the godless, materialistic way of life in the mainstream of Soviet society. I was sitting in the seat of a Soviet airplane, reflecting that this old man was right. I can stay in Russia, and it can still be that God's grace will reach me there here after all. A mountain village in Tajikistan looks very similar to that in Afghanistan, Iran, or even India. I can buy a cheap house there and then find a local village girl and marry her. The nature and countryside scenery is similar to everywhere else. The sky is also the same. So what difference does it make? East or west, people everywhere are the same, and the heavens are the same. Previously, I heard about a group of naive Moscow youth who came together and purchased 10 or so houses in the Caucasus Mountains with the intention of forming a religious commune, to meditate together and to live a life as a pious folk. However, as soon as the authorities learned about this, they prosecuted them and destroyed their dream community. The small town that I was looking for was situated not very far from Dushanbe, As I arrived there, I had no clear picture in my mind about what I should expect. In the location, I saw the huge buildings and a new mosque in the process of construction. All the architecture was on a grand scale. Somebody there told me that the millions of rubles were spent to build this. It was not clear who provided all that money, let alone to say who allowed it. Since it was a well-known fact that in the 70 years of its rule, the Red regime in Russia, the Kremlin, did not ever give a single permission to build any place of worship anywhere in the country.